I want you to imagine this seemingly impossible historical scenario for a second.
Okay, lay it on me.
Right. So picture a single ruling family that is simultaneously employing, like, Muslim siege engineers from the Middle East, Tibetan Buddhist monks, native Han Confucian scholars, and, wandering Italian merchants.
Quite the mix.
It really is. And picture them doing all of this while they're issuing state-sponsored paper money, building these massive public school systems, and this is the crazy part, trying to launch enormous armadas to conquer Japan.
It honestly sounds like a wildly inaccurate historical fiction novel, doesn't it?
Totally.
Like a mashup of completely different centuries and continents. But it is entirely real.
It is. And welcome to this deep dive, by the way. Today, our mission is to unpack the rapid rise and the incredibly dramatic fall of the Yuan dynasty.
Which is just a fascinating period.
Absolutely. We are going to explore how this unprecedented, kind of forced collision of cultures fundamentally shaped Eurasia. We'll be looking at your sources to analyze the long-term legacy of their truly revolutionary policies on, well, global trade, education, and technology. And if you're wondering why you should care about a dynasty from the 13th century, it's because this isn't just medieval history. I mean, you are basically looking at the blueprint for early globalism here.
You really are.
We are talking about the literal invention of fiat currency as a unified state system.
Yeah.
And honestly, a masterclass in both the brilliant triumphs and the fatal paranoid flaws of trying to manage a multicultural superpower.
Right, and setting the tone for this is crucial because when you hear the word Mongol, the immediate image is usually, cavalry archers sweeping across the steppe.
Just conquering everything in their path.
Exactly, pure military dominance. But the Yuan dynasty, which was founded by the Mongols, represents this fascinating pivot. This is the exact moment they had to transition from the chaotic expansion of nomadic warfare to incredibly complex, highly structured, bureaucratic statecraft.
Because you can't just conquer the world. I mean,
Yeah.
Eventually you actually have to run it.
Exactly. It's the story of conquerors trying to figure out how to govern.
So how do we get from steppe warlords to emperors of China? To understand this ascent, we obviously have to look at Kublai Khan.
Right.
But reading through these sources, I was struck by the fact that to understand Kublai, you don't actually start with him. Or even his grandfather, Genghis Khan.
No, you don't.
You actually have to look at his mother.
Tiny Becky.
Yeah.
She is, she's arguably one of the most brilliant political operators in global history.
Which is saying something.
It is. She was a princess of the Karaite tribe, and she married Genghis Khan's youngest son, to Louis. And crucially, Tani Becky possessed this profound geopolitical foresight.
She saw the writing on the wall.
She did. She recognized a fundamental shift occurring in the Mongol Empire. They were no longer just raiding neighboring nomadic tribes, They were expanding into deeply settled, agrarian, urbanized societies across Eurasia.
Right. They were taking over cities with millions of people, complex agriculture, established bureaucracies. And you can't just treat an agrarian metropolis like a giant pasture for your horses.
Precisely, though some traditional Mongols certainly wanted to.
Right, like just burn it down.
Exactly. The traditional strategy was often devastatingly simple. Conquer, extract wealth, and move on. Or worse, raise the city to literally create more grazing land for the cavalry.
Just wipe it off the map.
Yeah. But Tani Becky realized that to sustain the empire long-term, they needed to cultivate these societies, not destroy them. So she deliberately orchestrated her son's upbringing to prepare them for this totally new reality.
And for Kublai specifically, she does something incredible.
She makes a highly calculated move. Kublai was born in 1215, and she assigned a Tangut woman to be his nurse and early guardian.
And the Tangut...
They were Buddhists from a settled agrarian society in northwestern China.
So just think about that for a second. The daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan is actively bringing in a woman from a conquered, settled civilization to raise the future ruler of the steppe.
It's amazing.
She is literally hardwiring him for cultural adaptation from infancy.
It was a total masterstroke, and as Kublai grew, she encouraged him to immerse himself in Han Chinese culture.
Yeah.
This wasn't just casual reading either.
Like a hobby.
No, by the time he was a young man managing an estate in Hebei, which is a province in northern China, he wasn't surrounding himself with traditional Mongol generals.
Who was he hanging out with?
He was inviting Buddhist monks, like a really famous master named Yuan, and these Taoist-turned Buddhist scholars like Lu Bingzong to be his primary advisors.
Wow.
He was actively learning Confucian philosophy, the principles of Chinese painting, and the nuances of calligraphy.
I just try to imagine what that looked like to the older generation of Mongols, you know. The grandson of the great conqueror is sitting in a study practicing calligraphy instead of hunting out on the steppe.
It definitely ruffled some feathers.
I bet. But it pays off, right?
Mm.
Because when he inherits this territory in northern China, he gets this absolute crash course in why this agrarian mindset matters. Because initially, things go terribly wrong on his estate.
Oh, they do. In the early days of managing his appanage in Hebei, Kublai was, well, he was somewhat hands-off.
Like an absentee landlord.
Exactly. He allowed his local officials, many of them traditional Mongols or Central Asians who completely didn't understand Chinese agriculture, to basically run wild.
And they just tax everyone to death.
The taxation became aggressively extortionate. The officials treated the local Han Chinese peasants like a resource to be plundered endlessly.
The peasants did what anyone would do when faced with impossible taxes and brutality, right? They packed up and left.
They abandoned the fields.
Which is a huge problem.
It's the turning point. Because the traditional Mongol response to fleeing subjects would be military retaliation.
Just track them down and punish them.
Track them down, force them back, make an example of them. But Kublai, influenced by his Chinese advisors and, honestly, his mother's foresight, reacted differently.
What did he do?
He physically went to his estate, assessed the situation on the ground, and completely overhauled the administration. He revised the tax laws to actually be sustainable, and he fired the corrupt officials.
He has this realization that dead or fleeing peasants don't grow grain. And if they don't grow grain, they can't pay taxes.
Exactly.
It's this massive shift from a raiding economy to an administrative economy.
It profoundly shaped his worldview. He realized that wealth in a settled society comes from stability and predictable governance, not just violent extraction.
Okay, so he's building this highly functional power base in northern China, getting very comfortable with Han culture and administration. But the Mongol Empire is vast. And in 1259, the Great Khan, who is Kublai's older brother, Mongke, he dies while on campaign. So suddenly, there is this massive power vacuum.
Which triggers the Tuluid Civil War. And this is where the ideological divide within the Mongol Empire just violently fractures.
Right, because back in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, deep in the steppe, you have Kublai's younger brother, Arik Bok.
Arik Bok. He's the traditionalist.
The guy who stayed home and kept the old ways.
Yes. He represented the conservative Mongol faction who viewed Kublai's fascination with Chinese culture with deep suspicion, even disgust.
They hated it.
They really did. So, following Mongol tradition, Arik Bok convenes a massive council, a Kurultai, in Karakorum, and manages to get himself declared the new Great Khan by the traditional nobility.
But Kublai is thousands of miles away in China, with his own massive army, his Han Chinese staff, and a bunch of senior princes who, frankly, like the wealth flowing from the settled lands.
They like the lifestyle.
Exactly. So Kublai just holds his own Kurultai in China and declares himself Great Khan in 1260.
And just like that, we now have two brothers, two claimants to the throne, and the largest contiguous land empire in human history officially breaks apart.
So how does Kublai actually win this? Because Arik Boki has the traditional heartland, he has the capital, and he has a lot of the elite cavalry.
This is where Kublai's understanding of agrarian economics literally wins the war. He doesn't just rely on cavalry charges, he uses economic starvation.
How so?
Karakorum, being out on the arid steppe, could not produce enough food to support its own population, let alone a massive centralized army. It relied heavily on massive grain shipments from the agricultural lands of northern China.
Lands that Kublai now controls.
Precisely. Kublai simply cut the supply lines. He embargoed his own capital. It was a brutal, protracted siege of logistics. Karakorum began to starve.
You can't eat horses forever.
No. Without food, Arik Bok's support just evaporated, his armies dwindled, and by 1264, he had no choice but to surrender to Kublai.
It's a total victory for the agrarian administrative model over the nomadic raider model. But even though Kublai wins the civil war, he's left with this monumental PR problem.
Oh, massive.
He wants to rule all of China, but he is fundamentally a foreign conqueror in the eyes of millions of Han Chinese. And the Chinese have a deeply ingrained sense of historical continuity and legitimacy. You don't just show up on a horse and call yourself emperor.
No, you absolutely do not. The Chinese bureaucratic elite, the Confucian literati, they viewed the Mongols as barbarians. To them, legitimate rule was intrinsically tied to the mandate of heaven.
Right, the cosmic approval granted to a just ruler.
Exactly. And Kublai knew that military force could hold territory, sure, but it couldn't command genuine loyalty or cooperation from the millions of bureaucrats needed to actually run the country.
So in 1271, he makes this audacious move. He doesn't try to force them to be Mongols. He officially proclaims a new dynastic name, the Great Yuan.
It is a stunning piece of political theater and statecraft.
It really is.
He didn't choose a Mongol word. He had his Chinese advisors select the word Yuan from one of the most ancient and revered Chinese texts, the I Ching, or Book of Changes.
And Yuan means what, exactly?
It translates roughly to origin of the universe or primal force. By doing this, Kublai is speaking directly to the Chinese in their own philosophical language. He is formally claiming the mandate of heaven and placing himself squarely in the orthodox lineage of Chinese emperors.
Like he's succeeding the great Tang and Song dynasty.
Yes.
And he really leans into it, right? He starts wearing the imperial robes. He adopts the massive, intricate rituals of Confucian propriety. He even sets up shrines for ancestor veneration, which is deeply, deeply Chinese.
He fully commits to the bit.
Which is so interesting. I want to throw an analogy at you to see if this captures the dynamic. I always picture this like a modern corporate acquisition, but a highly unusual one.
Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine a massive, aggressive tech conglomerate buys out a prestigious, old-school legacy bank. Usually, the tech bros come in, fire the old guard, and force everyone to use their proprietary software and wear their branded hoodies.
Right, the classic hostile takeover.
Exactly. But here, the new CEO comes in, looks at the legacy bank's massive, complex client list, and realizes, if I change the logo, all the clients will flee.
So true.
So instead, the tech CEO puts on a three-piece suit, adopts the legacy bank's name, and starts using their HR policies just to prevent mass resignations.
That is true.
It's brilliant. But I mean, was it just a cynical PR move? Did he actually respect the culture, or was he just wearing it like a skin suit to keep the tax revenue flowing?
You know, that analogy is highly accurate in terms of the mechanics of the takeover. As for his sincerity, it was likely a mix of both pragmatism and genuine admiration. Kublai was deeply intellectually curious. He respected the effectiveness of Chinese statecraft, but fundamentally, yes, he was a pragmatist. The machinery of the Chinese state, the tax censuses, the granary systems, the postal networks, was centuries ahead of anything the Mongols had.
You can't just operate a machine that complex if you smash the control panel.
Exactly. He needed the native operators to keep the machine running. Adopting their rituals was essentially the price of admission to use their bureaucracy.
But this corporate rebranding infuriates his original investors, the traditional Mongols.
Completely. The steppe nobility were outraged. To them, the old customs of Genghis Khan were sacred.
They must have thought he was losing his mind.
We actually have records of them sending furious messages to Kublai, demanding to know why he was abandoning the laws of their ancestors for the laws of a conquered people. They viewed it as a profound betrayal of their identity.
And this isn't just, like, grumbling at Thanksgiving. It sparks decades of warfare, right?
Yes, most notably the Kaidu-Kublai War. Kaidu was Kublai's cousin, who controlled Central Asia. He openly declared himself the true heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, representing the traditional nomadic way of life.
And he fights him for, what, 30 years?
Over 30 years, a bitter, grinding war against Kublai's Sinicized empire.
So Kublai is fighting his own family to the west, but he is also simultaneously trying to finish the conquest of China to the south. The southern Song dynasty is still holding out.
Right.
And this isn't a quick campaign. It takes years of grueling sieges, crossing massive river systems, dealing with terrain totally unsuited for cavalry, culminating finally in 1279 at the Battle of Yuan.
And Yuan is a fascinating culmination because it wasn't a cavalry charge on the steppe. It was actually one of the largest naval engagements in history fought off the southern coast of China.
Which is wild for a Mongol army.
And the irony is profound here. The victorious Yuan naval forces were actually commanded by a Han Chinese general, Zhang Hongfan. Yes. He was leading a predominantly Han Chinese navy that had defected or been integrated into the Yuan military, fighting against the last loyalists of the native Song dynasty.
That perfectly illustrates Kublai's strategy, doesn't it? Using the machinery and people of China to conquer the rest of China.
Exactly.
And the end of that battle is incredibly tragic, based on the sources.
It really is. When the Song loyalists realized their fleet was trapped and the battle was utterly lost, the prime minister of the Song dynasty took the last emperor, who was just a small child, around 7 years old, in his arms and jumped into the sea.
Wow.
They drowned together rather than be captured. And with that child's death, the Song dynasty was extinguished, and Kublai Khan officially became the first non-Han emperor to conquer and rule all of China proper.
Okay, so he's won. He's secured this massive, united, wealthy China. Now, normally when an empire secures its borders, there's a tendency to look inward, right? To fortify, to protect the culture.
Sure. Right.
But Kublai does the exact opposite. He doesn't wall China off. He kicks the doors wide open.
He really does.
He turns his newly built capital, Dadu, which we know today as Beijing, into this throbbing, chaotic Eurasian hub of exchange. I mean, imagine walking the streets of 13th century Beijing and hearing Persian, Italian, Tibetan, and Mongolian all in the same marketplace.
This brings us to what is perhaps the most enduring and world-altering legacy of the Mongol Empire as a whole, the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace.
Let's break down how that actually worked, because it wasn't just a general sense of, like, goodwill. It was a physical and logistical reality.
Exactly. For the first time in human history, you had a single political entity whose influence stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Pacific coast of China.
Which is just a mind-boggling amount of land.
It is. And before the Mongols, the Silk Road was essentially a fractured relay race. A merchant would travel through dozens of different kingdoms, paying tolls, risking bandits, dealing with changing laws and currencies at every single border.
It was incredibly dangerous and expensive.
But under the Pax Mongolica, the empire provided unified protection. The Mongols severely punished banditry. They set up the Yem, which was an incredibly efficient postal and relay station system across the continent.
Oh, like the Pony Express, but massive.
Yes. A merchant with the proper credentials, a peza, which was essentially an imperial VIP passport, could travel safely from Persia to Beijing. They could stay at state-funded way stations, get fresh horses, and know they were under the protection of the Khan.
And this safety guarantee triggers a massive migration of talent. Let's look at the inbound traffic into China. Because Kublai wasn't just importing luxury goods, he was engineering a massive brain drain from the rest of the world into his court.
Definitely. Kublai operated what we might call a meritocracy of utility.
Meritocracy of utility, I like that.
He didn't care where you were from or what god you prayed to, as long as you possessed a skill that could help him govern, build, or conquer.
I want to talk about the astronomy first, because this blew my mind in the sources. He brings in Muslim astronomers. Why? Didn't the Chinese already have a very sophisticated astronomical tradition?
They did, but the Chinese calendar had drifted. And predicting eclipses and celestial movements was critical for the emperor's legitimacy. Remember the mandate of heaven we discussed?
Right. The emperor is the intermediary between heaven and earth.
Exactly. If the imperial calendar was wrong, it suggested the heavens were out of sync with the ruler.
A political disaster waiting to happen.
So true. The Islamic world, however, had preserved and heavily updated the astronomical works of the ancient Greeks, like Ptolemy. They had advanced spherical trigonometry and incredibly precise observational instruments. So Kublai invited a Persian astronomer named Jamal ad-Din to Beijing.
And the sources say Jamal ad-Din brought 7 new instruments. How did this actually change things? Like, what were they?
Well, these weren't just simple telescopes. We're talking about massive, complex astrolabes, armillary spheres for measuring celestial coordinates, and equinoctial dials.
Okay, so serious hardware.
Very serious. They allowed the Yuan court to make much more precise calculations of planetary movements, which they used to drastically correct the Chinese calendar. And it wasn't just astronomy. Muslim mathematicians also brought Arabic numerals, the 1 through 9, and the concept of zero that we use today.
Oh, wow, they brought that to China.
Yes, which revolutionized mathematics there, replacing the cumbersome rod calculus for complex equations.
And it wasn't just the stars or numbers, it was how they saw the Earth itself. Muslim cartographers brought highly accurate maps of the Middle East and Central Asia.
Right.
Because up until then, traditional Chinese maps were often very sinocentric, right? China was this massive continent in the middle, and everything else was just vague islands on the edge.
Exactly.
These new maps totally shifted the geopolitical perspective of the Yuan rulers. They could literally see the actual scope of their empire.
But it wasn't just abstract science like maps and math. The cultural exchange was highly intimate, literally dealing with life and death. Look at medicine.
Yes. The medical clash is fascinating. You have traditional Chinese medicine, which has been practiced for millennia, suddenly colliding with Middle Eastern and Western medical theories. How does that play out?
It's a perfect microcosm of the Yuan dynasty's approach to diversity. Muslim and Nestorian Christian physicians arrived in Beijing and established entirely new hospitals and medical institutes.
Oh, yeah.
They brought works like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which was the foundational medical textbook in the Islamic and European worlds for centuries.
But the underlying philosophies of these two medical systems are completely opposed, aren't they?
Fundamentally so. Traditional Chinese medicine is holistic, right? It's based on the philosophy of yin and yang, the flow of qi or vital energy, and the balance of the 5 elements within the body.
Right. And diagnosis involves reading pulses, examining the tongue, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Now compare that to the Western or Islamic medicine they brought.
Which was based on what?
It was based on the Greek humoral theory, the idea that the body is made of 4 physical humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness is seen as a physical imbalance of these fluids,
And how do you treat that?
often by physical interventions like bloodletting, purgatives, or complex pharmacology.
So if I'm a traditional Chinese physician,
Yeah.
and I'm treating the emperor's vital qi, and some foreign doctor comes in and says the emperor just has too much black bile and needs to be bled with leeches,
Yeah.
I mean, that is going to cause a massive professional fight.
And it did. The native Chinese medical elite vigorously opposed these foreign physicians. It contradicted their entire cosmological worldview.
I can imagine. So what did the Yuan government do? Did they force a synthesis between the two?
No, they simply funded parallel institutions.
Right.
Yeah, they created a Bureau of Muslim Medicine operating right alongside the traditional Imperial Medical Academy. The Yuan elite just used whichever doctor got
A
resolved.
meritocracy of utility.
Exactly. They let the systems coexist, but that physical and professional separation fostered deep resentment among the native scholars who felt their ancient traditions were being marginalized by barbarians.
If the pills work, we don't care about the philosophy. But the most dramatic example of this utility has to be military technology. Let's talk about the siege of Shenyang and the Huipipao.
This is one of the most pivotal military moments in East Asian history. For 5 years, the Mongol armies had been bogged down trying to take the twin cities of Shenyang and Fancheng.
5 years is a long time to be stuck.
It is. These cities were the gateway to the Southern Song dynasty. They were situated on a massive river, surrounded by water on 3 sides, and protected by incredibly thick, reinforced walls.
And the traditional Mongol traction trebuchets, the ones where a team of 100 men pull on ropes to swing the arm, those just weren't doing enough damage, right? Because the rocks were too small.
Exactly. Traction trebuchets are great for anti-personnel warfare or smashing wooden palisades, but they couldn't breach these massive masonry walls. The Mongols were stuck. So Kublai Khan utilized the Pax Mongolica.
He calls in a favor.
He sent a request to his nephew, the ruler of the Ilkhanate in Persia. He said, "Send me your best siege engineers."
He literally ordered weapons tech from across the continent, like Amazon Prime for siege weapons.
Pretty much. And 2 Muslim engineers, Ismail and al-Din from Iraq, made the massive journey across Asia to the front lines in China. They surveyed the situation and built the Huipipao, which translates to the Muslim trebuchet.
And mechanically, why was this weapon so devastating?
It was a counterweight trebuchet. Instead of relying on the coordinated pulling power of a team of men, it used a massive, multi-ton wooden box filled with earth and stones at the short end of the throwing arm.
Okay, so gravity does the work.
Exactly. When the counterweight dropped, it whipped the long arm forward with terrifying velocity, hurling stones weighing up to 200 or 300 pounds.
I read a primary source account of this. It said, when the stones hit the towers of Xiangyang, the noise was like thunder, and the earth physically shook.
I believe it.
It completely shattered the morale of the defenders, let alone the walls. The city surrendered shortly after.
It's a direct physical pipeline of cutting-edge military technology from the Middle East, fundamentally altering the balance of power in East Asia.
But the traffic wasn't just one way, which is important to point out.
Yeah,
The West gained immensely from this open door.
absolutely.
Outbound from China, you have the formula for purified saltpeter, which drastically increased the explosive power of gunpowder in Europe. You have the westward spread of printing techniques, which laid the groundwork for Gutenberg. You have Chinese medical literature, playing cards, and the sudden appearance of blue and white Jingdezhan porcelain in the Middle East.
The world was suddenly tightly interconnected.
Which brings up the challenge of communication and administration. I mean, how do you govern an empire with a dozen different major languages and religions? Kublai's approach to religion is fascinating. He was famously tolerant, but he definitely played favorites.
Pragmatic favoritism. Kublai elevated Tibetan Buddhism above other faiths. He formed a very close alliance with a Tibetan Lama named Phagpa, appointing him as the imperial preceptor.
And what did that mean practically?
This gave Phagpa immense power, essentially making him the spiritual head of all Buddhist monks in the empire.
But why Tibetan Buddhism specifically? Why not native Chinese Taoism or traditional Mongol shamanism?
Tibet was strategically crucial. By patronizing the Sakya sect of Tibetan Buddhism, Kublai secured the political submission of Tibet without having to fight a costly war in the Himalayas.
Oh, smart.
Furthermore, Tibetan Buddhism, with its complex rituals, mysticism, and concepts of divine kingship, appealed to the Mongols in a way that the highly bureaucratic, rationalist Confucianism just did not.
That makes sense.
Yes.
And Phagpa wasn't just a spiritual advisor, was he? He was tasked with this monumental administrative project, creating a universal language, the Phagpa script.
Yes. Kublai recognized a massive bureaucratic nightmare. Decrees had to be translated into Chinese, Mongolian, Uyghur, Persian, and Tibetan.
Just a nightmare for the clerks.
Exactly. And the Chinese characters were incredibly difficult for foreigners to learn, and the Uyghur script the Mongols had been using wasn't suited to represent the sounds of spoken Chinese.
So what did Phagpa actually design? How did it work?
He designed a phonetic alphabet based on the Tibetan script, but written vertically like Chinese.
Okay.
It was brilliant in its conception. Unlike Chinese characters, which represent whole words or concepts, the Phagpa script represented sounds.
Like English.
Right. The idea was that any language in the empire, whether it was the guttural sounds of Mongolian or the tonal sounds of Chinese, could be accurately spelled out phonetically using this one set of square characters.
A universal alphabet to bind the empire together. Did it actually work?
Well, on official monuments, paper money, and imperial decrees, yes, you see it everywhere in the archaeology.
But as a daily language.
And a daily language for the populace, no. The Chinese literati absolutely refused to adopt a phonetic alphabet that stripped away the thousands of years of historical meaning embedded in their traditional characters.
Right. They viewed it as a barbaric oversimplification.
Exactly.
Which perfectly encapsulates the underlying friction of this whole dynasty. You have this incredibly diverse society. Kublai has Tibetan monks inventing alphabets, Muslim governors running 8 of his 12 major administrative districts, Nestorian Christians in the military, and, Marco Polo claiming to be a salt commissioner.
It's a crowded court.
Right. But if you are a native Han Chinese elite, a scholar whose family has studied Confucian texts for generations just to earn a place in the government, how do you feel watching all this?
You feel entirely disenfranchised. The traditional civil service examination system, the very mechanism by which Chinese scholars achieved power and status, was suspended for decades.
They must have been furious.
The native elite were sidelined in their own country, governed by foreigners who didn't even read their language.
The friction is just building and building. But to keep this massive, diverse machine running, to facilitate this incredible movement of people, armies, and ideas across the largest empire on Earth, the Yuan needed a radically new economic engine.
They did.
Because you can't fund global megaports and massive trebuchets with just barter and heavy copper coins.
No, you cannot. To manage an empire of this scale, infrastructure and finance are destiny. Let's look at the physical infrastructure first. Kublai dramatically expanded the Grand Canal.
This was a massive engineering feat, right?
Yeah.
Because the old canal went west to the old capitals. Kublai needed it to go north to Beijing.
Exactly. The political center was now in the north, but the economic and agricultural heartland was in the south, down in the fertile Yangtze River basin.
So he reroutes it.
Right. To feed his new capital and his massive armies, Kublai engineered new sections of the canal, driving it straight up to Beijing. Millions of tons of grain could now flow north. Simultaneously, maritime trade exploded. Cities in the south, like Quanzhou, transformed into global megaports, teeming with Arab, Persian, and Indian merchant fleets.
So the physical goods are moving, but how do you pay for it all? Transporting thousands of pounds of copper coins or silver bullion across the Silk Road or up the Grand Canal is slow, it's incredibly expensive to guard, and it really limits the speed of commerce.
It's a huge bottleneck, which leads to what I consider the most mind-blowing innovation of the Yuan dynasty. The year is 1260, and Kublai introduces the jiaokao.
The jiaokao, the first unified, state-sponsored fiat paper currency in human history.
Fiat currency. Money that has value simply because the government says it does. And it was printed on the bark of mulberry trees, right?
Yes.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of this because it is so incredibly modern.
Previous Chinese dynasties, like the Song, had experimented with paper money, but they were essentially promissory notes. They were backed by specific deposits of coins. They often expired after a few years, and they were only valid in certain regions.
Like a localized IOU. Exactly. What Kublai did was entirely different in scale and audacity. The Jiaokao was valid across the entire empire, and it had no expiration date.
And at first, it was backed by silver, right? You could theoretically trade your mulberry bark in for precious metal.
Initially, yes, to build trust in the system. But then, as the system took hold, the government executed this breathtaking financial maneuver. They mandated that the Jiaokao was the sole legal tender.
And what did that mean for the silver?
They actively confiscated gold and silver from private citizens and foreign merchants arriving in China.
So if a Venetian merchant or an Arab trader arrives in Quanzhou with a chest full of silver bullion,
The Yuan government seized the silver for the imperial treasury and handed the merchant a stack of printed paper in return.
I mean, imagine being a foreign merchant. You hand over solid silver, and a bureaucrat gives you pieces of bark with red ink on them. It sounds insane.
It does.
I've often heard people compare this to cryptocurrency, calling it a collective economic hallucination that only works if everyone agrees to believe in it. But it's more tangible than that, isn't it? It wasn't just a voluntary hallucination. There was a very real mechanism forcing them to believe.
Exactly. It wasn't just blind faith. It was coercion backed by state power. How do you give a piece of paper intrinsic value? You demand that all taxes must be paid in that specific paper.
Of course.
Every citizen in the empire owed taxes to the Khan. The only way to pay those taxes without facing the wrath of the Mongol military was to use Jiaokao.
So they created the demand.
Yes. Therefore, everyone needed the paper. Because everyone needed it to pay the government, everyone was willing to trade real goods, food, silk, labor, to get it. The state manufactured demand for the currency by making it the only key to survival.
That is a brilliant and terrifying explanation of fiat currency. And for a time, it worked phenomenally well, didn't it?
It revolutionized commerce. Transaction costs plummeted. A merchant could carry the equivalent of tons of copper coins in a small pouch in his tunic.
Which is much easier to protect from bandits.
It accelerated trade velocity across Eurasia. It also centralized immense economic power in the hands of the Yuan court. They literally controlled the printing press of the world's largest economy.
But to run this system, to track the taxes, to manage the paper money supply, to inspect the megaports, and oversee the grain shipments, you needed an army of accountants, clerks, and bureaucrats.
A massive army.
But as we established earlier, Kublai didn't fully trust the traditional Han Chinese Confucian elite. So how on earth did he staff this massive administrative stake?
Well, initially he relied heavily on his imported foreign administrators, the Simu class, the Muslims, Tibetans, and Central Asians we discussed.
Right.
But there simply weren't enough of them to run the micro levels of an empire containing tens of millions of people. You need local clerks in every single county. So Kublai undertook massive, unprecedented educational reforms.
And the numbers here are wild.
Historical records indicate the creation of over 20,000 public schools during his reign.
20,000 public schools in the 13th century. That is a staggering number. Why build them?
He needed a new generation of local bureaucrats who were trained in practical administration, mathematics, and translation, rather than just classical Confucian poetry and philosophy.
Wow.
He was trying to bypass the traditional elite by educating a new, loyal working class of administrators.
But eventually, the sheer demographic weight of the Han Chinese makes this impossible to maintain forever, right? This system eventually needs the traditional scholars.
Yes, it does. The pressure to integrate the traditional Chinese elite became unavoidable. After Kublai's death, the administration realized they were losing out on a massive pool of highly educated talent. Finally, in 1313, under the Emperor Buyantu Khan, who was much more sympathetic to Chinese culture, the Yuan dynasty reinstated the traditional civil service examinations.
So on paper, no pun intended, if you look at the Yuan dynasty around the year 1320, they look like an incredibly modern, inclusive, almost utopian state.
They really do.
They have thousands of public schools, a unified paper currency, a merit-based examination system, universal alphabets, and global free trade. It sounds like paradise.
It looks that way from a high-altitude systemic view. But the reality on the ground, the societal reality for the average person living in China, was incredibly dark and stratified.
Which brings us to the fatal flaw in the foundation. The very policies they used to control this massive population planted the seeds for the empire's violent destruction. Let's talk about the four-class system and the fracturing of society.
When Kublai Khan structured the legal and social framework of his society, he didn't create a melting pot. He created a rigid, segregated hierarchy of reliability, legally dividing the population into four distinct tiers.
Walk me through the tiers. Who is at the top?
At the absolute pinnacle were the Mongols themselves. They were a tiny fraction of the population, but they held the highest military commands, the ultimate veto power in government, and enjoyed massive legal privileges and tax exemptions.
Okay, the conquerors get the spoils. Who is next?
The second class were the Simo, which roughly translates to people with colored eyes, or various categories. This was the imported administrative class.
The foreigners.
Yes. It included the allied groups from Central Asia, the Middle East, the Uyghurs, the Persians, the Europeans. They served as the high-level bureaucrats, the powerful provincial governors, the tax farmers, and the specialized engineers. They were the middle management of the empire.
And the native Chinese, where do they fall?
They made up the bottom two tiers. The third class were the Han. But in this legal context, Han specifically meant the northern Chinese, the Khitans, and the Jurchens.
Why them specifically?
These were the people who had been conquered decades earlier and had lived under steppe rule for a longer time. They were considered slightly more reliable.
Which leaves a vast majority of the population at the absolute bottom.
The fourth class, the Southerners, the former subjects of the Southern Song dynasty. They were the last to be conquered, they were the most numerous, and they held the most fiercely independent Chinese cultural identity.
So they were the biggest threat.
Exactly. Consequently, they were treated with the utmost suspicion and placed at the absolute bottom of the legal hierarchy.
What did that look like in practice? Was it just social stigma, or were there real legal consequences?
Oh, it was a brutal legal reality. A glass ceiling was rigidly enforced. Even when the civil service exams were brought back, quotas were strictly manipulated to ensure that Southerners could almost never achieve high office.
Wow.
And criminally, it was wildly unbalanced. If a Mongol murdered a Southerner, the penalty might be a fine or reassignment. If a Southerner struck a Mongol, the penalty was severe, often death. Southerners were forbidden from owning weapons, forbidden from congregating in large groups, and forbidden from even learning the Mongolian language.
It sounds incredibly oppressive.
Yeah.
I know many modern historians describe the Yuan rule over the South as possessing a distinctly colonial feel, like an occupying force extracting wealth while actively suppressing the native population.
That is a very accurate description. It is the great paradox of the Yuan dynasty. They were immensely curious, culturally importing ideas, science, and trade from all over the world, but they were profoundly oppressive socially.
But I have to push back here for a second, because this seems completely illogical based on what we've established about Kublai Khan.
How so?
If Kublai was a pragmatist, if he realized he needed to adopt Chinese branding and rituals to prevent a revolt, why implement such a rigid, resentful class system? Didn't he see that permanently alienating 80% of his population was just a recipe for disaster?
This raises a critical point about the limits of imperial power and the psychology of the conquerors. We have to view this through the lens of Mongol paranoia. Kublai was constantly walking a tightrope, fighting a two-front war for legitimacy. He had to placate the Chinese bureaucracy to keep the state running, yes, but he also had to prove to his fellow Mongols, who were already rebelling against him for being too Chinese, that he hadn't gone soft.
Okay.
He had to maintain Mongol supremacy.
So the caste system was basically a way to reassure the traditionalists, like, don't worry, we are still undeniably in charge.
Exactly. But it was also born from a deep existential demographic terror.
Terror of what, exactly?
Of being swallowed whole. Think about the numbers. There were perhaps 1 or 2 million Mongols in China, supported by maybe a few 100,000 Semu allies. They were ruling over a population of roughly 70 to 80 million ethnic Chinese.
That is a massive disparity.
If the Mongols allowed true equality, if they allowed a pure meritocracy without ethnic quotas, they would be culturally and politically absorbed by the sheer demographic weight of the Chinese within a generation.
They'd just disappear.
The four-class system was a desperate mechanism of control to prevent the conquerors from disappearing into the conquered.
Okay, that makes sense strategically from their perspective. It's a system born of fear, but fear makes you erratic. And the resentment wasn't just building from the bottom up. As the dynasty progressed, they actually started turning on their own middle managers, the Semu class, didn't they?
They did, and this was a fatal miscalculation. Under Kublai's successors, the policies became increasingly erratic and xenophobic. As the empire faced financial difficulties and localized rebellions, the Mongol elite looked for scapegoats.
And the Simus were wealthy, so they were an easy target.
Exactly. The Muslim merchants and administrators had grown incredibly wealthy and powerful under early Yuan tolerance. They controlled the tax farming and the lucrative maritime trade. The Mongol nobility grew incredibly jealous and suspicious of this power.
The sources mention a dramatic shift in religious tolerance. Kublai himself, near the end of his life, actually decreed the death penalty for anyone who slaughtered cattle, according to Islamic halal or Jewish kosher laws.
Yes.
He tried to force them to eat meat, prepared the Mongol way, which involved striking the animal's heart without shedding blood.
It was a massive reversal from the guy who happily employed Muslim governors and astronomers just a few decades earlier. It was an assertion of raw dominance.
Just flexing power.
And later emperors went further. They passed laws stripping tax exemptions from Muslim holy men, restricting their marriages to native Chinese, and severely limiting their legal authority in disputes.
And you cannot marginalize the very people who run your economy and your ports without explosive consequences.
You really cannot. This systemic alienation led directly to localized revolts from the Simu class itself. The most prominent example is the Ispa Rebellion in the 1350s, centered in the megaport of Quanzhou.
The very port that drove their maritime wealth.
Exactly. The Persian Muslim garrison in Quanzhou, the descendants of the people who had built this massive maritime trade network for the Yuan, actually violently revolted against the dynasty.
And how long did that last?
The ensuing conflicts lasted for nearly a decade and absolutely devastated the southern economy. It essentially severed the Yuan dynasty's maritime lifeline.
So let's look at the state of the empire in the mid-14th century. The internal resentment is a powder keg. You have millions of angry, heavily taxed Chinese peasants. You have an entirely alienated class of Confucian scholars who have been shut out of power. And now you have the foreign merchant class actively rebelling.
Everything is fracturing.
All the structural supports are failing. All it takes is a few bad decisions, a ruined economy, and some bad weather to light the match, which brings us to the collapse.
The unraveling of the Yuan dynasty is arguably one of the most spectacular textbook cases of imperial overreach combined with catastrophic fiscal mismanagement in recorded history.
Let's start with the overreach,
Yeah.
because Kublai Khan successfully conquered all of China, but he suffered from the conqueror's disease, didn't he?
Well,
He simply couldn't
I
stop.
had to keep pushing.
He launched these massively costly, logistically impossible military campaigns into Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Java, Burma. But the campaigns that truly broke the myth of Mongol invincibility were the invasions of Japan.
1274 and 1281. The hubris involved in these campaigns is just staggering. Japan was a mountainous island nation, heavily fortified, fiercely independent, and defended by a seasoned warrior class, the samurai.
Right.
But Kublai, believing the entire world rightfully belonged to the Khan, demanded they become a vassal state. When they refused and executed his ambassadors, he mobilized.
From a tactical standpoint, this is a fascinating matchup. Steppe warfare versus samurai combat.
Yeah.
The sources talk about how the samurai were initially totally disoriented by Mongol tactics.
Oh, completely.
Because the Japanese were accustomed to a highly ritualized form of warfare, riding out, declaring their lineage, and seeking honorable individual combat.
And the Mongols had absolute contempt for that. They fought as a tightly controlled, highly disciplined, unified machine directed by flags and drums.
So when a samurai rides out,
When a samurai rode out to issue a challenge, the Mongols just showered him with poisoned arrows and explosive ceramic bombs fired from catapults. Militarily, the Mongols were a terror on the beaches.
But the beaches weren't the problem. The ocean was. The Mongols were masters of the horse, not the sea. And for the second invasion in 1281, Kublai went all in. He sent an absolutely massive armada, around 4,400 ships, carrying over 140,000 troops.
Just unbelievable numbers.
It was the largest amphibious invasion fleet in history until D-Day.
But they were hit by a massive, catastrophic typhoon, which the Japanese famously termed the kamikaze, or divine wind. The fleet was utterly destroyed. Tens of thousands of troops drowned or were slaughtered on the beaches when their ships shattered.
For centuries, the narrative was just that Kublai got incredibly unlucky with the weather. But modern archaeology has proven that it wasn't just an act of God, was it? It was an act of terrible bureaucratic mismanagement.
This is where the maritime archaeology of Kenzo Hayashida is so illuminating. His team spent years excavating the wreckage of the 1281 fleet off the coast of Takashima Island in Japan.
And what did they find down there?
What they discovered in the mud completely changed our understanding of the disaster. They found that Kublai had placed impossible demands on his shipbuilders.
He rushed production.
Drastically. A fleet of 4,400 ocean-going warships should have taken up to 5 years to construct, to properly cure the timber, and to fit out. Kublai demanded the fleet be ready in 1 year.
1 year. So they must have cut every corner imaginable.
They did. The archaeologists found that a massive percentage of the fleet were not actually ocean-going warships. Because of the impossible deadline, the Yuan officials simply commandeered any available vessel they could find, including thousands of flat-bottom riverboats designed for the calm waters of the Grand Canal.
Oh, no.
Furthermore, they found evidence that the ships were hastily assembled using poor-quality, unseasoned wood and lacked the deep, V-shaped, curved keels necessary for stability in open water.
They sent 140,000 men into the treacherous, typhoon-prone ocean between Korea and Japan in flat-bottomed river barges.
Yes.
They were practically designed to capsize at the first sign of a storm. The arrogance is astounding.
It was a monumental disaster. And the geopolitical fallout was immense. The Mongol aura of sheer invincibility was permanently shattered. The subjects of the empire realized that the heavens did not guarantee every victory for the Khan.
And beyond the psychological blow, the financial cost of building 4,400 ships, outfitting 140,000 men, and then losing absolutely all of it. It must have bankrupted the treasury.
Which leads directly to the economic collapse. Because how does a government pay for massive failed wars when the peasant tax base is already squeezed to its absolute limit? You turn to the revolutionary financial invention you control.
The printing press. The Jiaokawa. They just printed more money to cover the debt.
Precisely. To finance the grinding wars against the Song, the failed invasions of Japan, and the disastrous campaigns in Southeast Asia, the Yuan government vastly expanded the money supply. They treated the printing press as an infinite source of wealth.
Never a good idea.
Between 1273 and 1276 alone, the issue of paper currency exploded from 110,000 units to over 1.4 million units.
And this is the fundamental danger of fiat currency. If you print paper without underlying economic growth to support it, you trigger hyperinflation. The money becomes worthless.
The collective hallucination broke. When the government lost its military invincibility on the beaches of Japan and then demonstrated a total lack of fiscal discipline at the printing presses in Beijing, the populace lost all faith in the currency.
Right.
The coercion stopped working. People refused to accept the mulberry bark. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed, wiping out the savings and livelihoods of millions. The entire economic engine of the Pax Mongolica just seized up.
So the people are broke, the government is weak, the merchants are revolting, and then, as if the universe is writing a Greek tragedy, the natural disasters strike.
In the 1340s, the climate turned against them. The rural countryside, already impoverished by hyperinflation and heavy taxes, suffered from terrible, prolonged droughts.
It's horrible timing.
And this was followed by catastrophic flooding of the Yellow River, which burst its banks and altered its course, destroying millions of acres of farmland.
Which inevitably leads to widespread famine. Millions starving. And we have to view this through the lens of Chinese political philosophy. We talked about the mandate of heaven earlier, how Kublai used it to legitimize his rule, but the mandate is a double-edged sword.
It is a conditional contract. If the emperor is just and righteous, the heavens bless the land with peace and bountiful harvests. But if the emperor is corrupt, or if the dynasty has lost its virtue, the heavens signal their displeasure through floods, famines, and plagues.
So failing to manage the Yellow River floods wasn't just an infrastructure problem for the Yuan. It was the ultimate, undeniable cosmic signal that they had lost the mandate of heaven. Their legitimacy just evaporated overnight.
The Yuan government, paralyzed by factional infighting and a bankrupt treasury, lacked the effective administrative capacity to provide disaster relief. They tried to force hundreds of thousands of starving peasants into slave labor gangs to repair the river dikes.
Oh, that's terrible.
That was the breaking point. Popular support evaporated completely.
It's incredible to contrast this tragic collapse with the image of Kublai Khan at his peak. We started this deep dive with him as a vibrant, intellectually curious young man, holding court with scholars, carefully designing a new dynasty. But the historical sources paint a very different picture of him in his final years.
His twilight years are deeply tragic. His most trusted advisor and favorite wife, Chabi, who had guided many of his most successful policies, died. His chosen heir, his son Zenjin, died prematurely. His grand military ambitions in Japan and Java had ended in humiliating failure. The treasury was bleeding.
And the sources say he fell into a deep depression and turned heavily to food and alcohol for comfort.
He became grossly overweight. He suffered terribly from gout, exacerbated by a traditional Mongol diet heavy in meat and alcohol and likely diabetes. He became isolated and erratic.
It's really sad.
It is a stark, almost poetic physical manifestation of the condition of his empire bloated, suffering from overindulgence, struggling to support its own immense weight, and slowly dying from within.
And after Kublai dies in 1294, his successors just cannot hold the fragile coalition together. They cycle through emperors rapidly, assassinations become common. By 1351, all these systemic pressures, the hyperinflation, the famines, the ethnic resentment of the four-class system, the forced labor on the river, it all finally erupts into massive open rebellion.
The most significant of these was the Red Turban Rebellion. It was a massive millenarian uprising led by Han Chinese peasants who were absolutely determined to drive the Mongol barbarians out of China once and for all.
And out of this chaotic, bloody civil war rises a figure who is the polar opposite of the Mongol nobility. Zhu Yuanzhang, a man who started as an impoverished, starving peasant, spent time as a wandering beggar and a Buddhist monk, and eventually became a brilliant, ruthless rebel commander. He rallies the Chinese populace and founds the Ming dynasty.
And in 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces marched on the capital, Beijing.
And what does the Yuan court do? Do they fight to the last man for the mandate of heaven?
No. The last Yuan emperor in China, Tokan Timur, realizes the situation is hopeless. He doesn't mount a final, glorious defense. He simply packs up his court, opens the northern gates of Beijing, and flees.
He just leaves.
He retreats back to the very steppes of Mongolia from which his ancestors had emerged just over a century earlier.
It is stunning how quickly it unraveled. An empire that spanned the known world, that revolutionized global trade and currency, collapsed and was chased back to the grasslands in a matter of decades.
They returned to Mongolia, maintaining a remnant steppe state known as the Northern Yuan, but their era of global imperial dominance was permanently over.
Yes, let's step back and look at the legacy here as we wrap up this deep dive. The Yuan dynasty itself was relatively fleeting. They only ruled all of unified China for about 89 years.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of Chinese history, that's just a blink of an eye. But the impact
of that brief window fundamentally and forever altered global history. The Yuan territorially unified northern and southern China for the first time in 300 years, establishing a massive geographic footprint that heavily influenced the borders of the later Qing dynasty and indeed the borders of modern China today.
And economically, they proved a concept that governs our entire lives today.
Yeah.
They proved that a centralized state could mandate a paper currency as the sole legal tender of a massive economy.
They forced a level of East-West interaction that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. The Pax Mongolica acted as a massive historical accelerator.
Yeah.
They exported revolutionary technologies like printing and purified gunpowder to Europe and the Middle East, which catalyzed the Renaissance and changed the face of global warfare. They facilitated a cross-pollination of astronomical, medical, and geographic knowledge that rewired how humanity understood the world.
It's fascinating that even the Ming dynasty, the native Chinese dynasty founded by Zhu Yuanzhang, who overthrew the Mongols and publicly despised them as barbaric foreign occupiers, even they couldn't escape the Yuan legacy. The Ming actually admired and adopted many of the Yuan's military structures, their garrison systems, and their provincial administrative boundaries.
Exactly. The Ming dynasty and Europe and the Middle East all inherited a world that the Yuan dynasty had fundamentally, irrevocably rewired.
Well, thank you for joining us on this incredibly expansive journey. This deep dive into your sources really highlights a profound historical lesson. It shows that while incredible innovation, massive infrastructure, and a pragmatic embrace of cultural diversity can build an empire of unprecedented scale and wealth, systemic inequality, deep-seated paranoia, and unchecked fiscal hubris will almost certainly destroy it.
It is an incredibly delicate, fragile balance to maintain.
When we started this deep dive, I asked you to imagine a chaotic, contradictory empire, one that defies our desire to view history as neat, categorized, and color-coded. The Yuan dynasty proves that history is profoundly messy. It is built on uneasy compromises, temporary alliances, and incredibly fragile agreements. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to ponder as you go about your day. The Yuan dynasty proved that while sheer, terrifying military might can conquer a disconnected world, it takes shared beliefs like faith in the value of a printed piece of paper, or the acceptance of a unified cultural identity to actually hold that world together. Looking at our highly connected, deeply complex, and often polarized world today, What happens when our own shared belief in those global systems starts to fracture?
That is the ultimate question of statecraft, isn't it?
Something to mull over. Until next time, keep diving deep.